Welcome to Dry January. I'm Sheila Hamilton, and this is Beyond Well, along with our producer, John.
Hello, Sheila. What's cooking today?
We're going to talk today with some women that have been the most brutally honest about the impact of addiction on their family lives. Megan Brown, Naomi Castor, and Connie McDowell share these really personal, grueling insights as to the toll that it takes to love someone who is suffering in this way, and how they've had to, in some ways, come to peace with their loved ones' decisions to continue to use. As you know, John, I lost a nephew to addiction, and I continue to grieve his absence every single day. Some of these family members, their person they love with an addiction is still alive, but they are already in the grieving process of losing them. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I do and share it with your friends and loved ones. Someone who has a person in their family who is using, I think, could really benefit from hearing these stories.
Fora Health is a nonprofit alcohol and drug treatment center in Portland, Oregon that has been helping youth, adults, and families for nearly 50 years. They offer compassionate, comprehensive, and affordable care for everyone, regardless of background, orientation, or ability to pay. Fora recently opened a new state-of-the-art campus in Portland's Southeast Gateway District, and the entire campus is healing and supportive. You can find out more about their full array of evidence-based therapies for drug and alcohol treatment at www.forahealth.org. If you or a loved one needs support, there are many options and personalized approaches to care. Reach out to Fora Health at 503-535-1151 or see the show notes for more details.
I just want to give a big welcome to our guests, Naomi, Mariah, and Connie. Thank you so much for agreeing to be here today. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to begin with you, Connie, because you have a child who is still dealing with addiction as a young adult. And I want you to describe the story of how you came here and why you're so passionate about this topic.
Oh, I'm happy to share my story. Our son's disease did not present to us until college, which I think is unusual. It was there all along, but high school sports, I think, kept anxieties at bay. But when he got to college and he was no longer a big star athlete and didn't have the structure of family and school, his depression, anxiety really. And so he, went into a lot of isolation in college. And eventually, by about junior year, we told him to come home. And then we started the enabling process, the 600 ways to enable, and to sell him on the sober world and to help him straddle these two worlds. And that did not work at all.
Mariah, what about you? What brought you here?
What brought me to the field of addiction and mental health counseling was my family's just really complex, long history of addiction. My grandfather and my dad were both war veterans. My dad was a heroin addict from a young age and went through a lot of struggles with his mental health undiagnosed. So I got to witness a lot of, complex trauma at an early age. My mom was an alcoholic. And then something kind of pretty remarkable happened in the process as I witnessed the resilience and from the inside, the gift that it gave me, that my parents were so strong and so amazing. And I watched their recovery journey. So I was able to witness them. My dad has about 12 years sobriety, and I think my mom's at about 14 from alcohol. So it just really gave me a hope, and it helped me challenge stigma of addiction. And so I just really wanted to pay it forward.
I think it's so wonderful that we have both the child perspective of watching a parent, and we also have the parent who has watched the child. So I feel in very good hands today as well. Naomi, what about you?
So as an alcoholic living in recovery, I did come also from a family of addiction. Well into my 30s, I thought that I had escaped the effects of that disease, and then realized that I needed to get support, that I needed to reevaluate my life and what I was doing and get sober. So with the help of, 12-step, supports and resources and family members who also live in recovery, I was able to get sober and continue my work. I was already a therapist, but then I started to incorporate more of that dual diagnosis into my work from my personal experience with myself and with my family, and realized you just can't treat one without the other.
Yeah. Why don't we begin there? How much of a role would all of you say, and I'd like each of your experiences to help inform your answer, how much of a role does trauma have to play in addiction and substance abuse disorders? Naomi?
Well, working here at Fora Health Youth, every single one of these young men that come into our facility, or young people, I should say, come in with various levels of significant trauma. When they start to unravel that, you can see that preceded the addiction, that often also preceded many of the mental health issues that we see that may have already been there, may not have been, or may be worsened along with the addiction. But a lot of those family traumas go undiscussed. There's secrets, there's family secrets, and they come to us often. It's the first time they've actually talked about it, and they don't always recognize it as trauma. Also, just with my personal family, I know that many of the people who struggle with addiction in my family also had significant trauma along with the genetic predisposition, which just made that all bubble up.
Mariah, what about you?
I think just maneuvering through this life, being a teenager, is traumatic. May not be the DSM classification of trauma, but I definitely think that life is challenging and traumatic, and addiction is traumatizing. So if there's a family history of addiction, that alone is just, an intergenerational trauma that gets passed forward. So I agree with Naomi and what she said about the trauma, but I think there's a lot of subtle traumas too that play into addiction that we as dual diagnosis counselors can really pay attention to, and just look at some of that family history, and just some of that social anxiety can be very traumatizing to an adolescent, not fitting in and things like that. So
Yeah,
I
bullying.
definitely think
Yeah,
trauma
all the niceties of growing up that are not very nice at all. Connie,
exactly.
what about your son's story? Was there hidden trauma there that he'd been unable to process?
Really interesting because our experience is the opposite. He says he had all green lights in his childhood. We thought we were putting on the Norman Rockwell childhood, and we didn't know that he had this underlying depression and anxiety issue. And so when he started self-medicating, that's when the trauma started.
Yeah.
He was plunged into a world that he had never seen. He needed the medication, the drugs, and yet it was very traumatic for him to go into this world where he could get it.
I want you, if you would, to share the story of when you realized that you were completely powerless over your loved one's addiction. Do you mind, Connie?
No, not at all. For us, we were in the midst of all this enabling, just really surrounding him with, all the support that we could. We created a job for him within our company. We made sure he had a nice car, a nice place to live, thinking that those were all the cures, and that we would make the sober world look so shiny and alluring. But at kind of the height of his success in his career that we created for him, he had to give a presentation in a large group in our company. He had been drinking all day, evidently, because of the anxiety of public speaking. He did very well in his presentation, and then he escaped from the event and went out on I-5 and was involved in a car accident. And while thankfully no one was hurt seriously, there were significant legal and financial issues to settle, which we as the enabling family did. And after that, he went to a treatment center where we, of course, thought we would be one and done, that he would get the cure.
I think that this issue of enabling is very muddy for many families because people say, what is the difference between loving and supporting someone who has an addiction versus enabling them? I'd love to hear your distinction, Connie, and then have Naomi and Mariah weigh in as well.
It's a whole different kind of loving. And it really involves separating the disease from your child and trying to figure out how to support your child and not enable the disease. And that was really hard. Having that 1 degree of separation, you have to, and loving detachment, you just have to work at it every single day because you really want to save them and rescue them from this disease. And you want your voice to be louder than that addiction voice in their head. It's a lifelong learning curve. And if I didn't go to Al-Anon and get constant reinforcement for how to love this child and how to settle for a partial relationship, I'd be lost.
I heard it put so well the other day from a friend who said, I created the boundaries between my child and his addiction so that there was love to come back to after all of this. Because so many families are aware of the crime that takes place, the humiliation that takes place, the even sometimes physical harm to people in the family sect when somebody is actively using. So I really appreciate that, Connie. Mariah, do you have any words of advice about that? How do you recognize codependence? How do you recognize enabling?
Yeah, I'll back on what Connie said. When I was 15, I attended my first Alateen meeting, and that taught me the difference between being a codependent supporter and interdependence. And as I got older, I realized, relationships are a give and take. I give, you take, you give, I take. And I realized if I was giving more than I was receiving, then there's an imbalance going on. And that really helped me at an early age realize that. And as a family unit, and even if you're in a friendship unit, it's like a machine. It's well oiled and it balances each other. And when you have a piece out of place, it doesn't run right.
Yeah.
So I think in families, learning the difference between just interdependent and codependent and realizing we can't do that for the person. We can't take their part.
Naomi, it's a different skill set entirely because most parents just want to give and to offer love and to offer support, and we don't have to parse out really too often what that looks like and whether it's a life or death matter.
Yeah.
Naomi, in your practice, how do you help parents, especially or loved ones, recognize and be able to put limits and boundaries around their offerings to their children?
That's a great question. And in full transparency, when I listened to the three of you talk about codependency, I realized that this is something that, as a child of alcoholics and an alcoholic in recovery, I still struggle with that. Learning how to set those boundaries. It's a lifelong process. But in my work here at Fora Health, when I'm working with families and when I'm supervising the therapists who are working with families, I try really hard to encourage everybody to meet in the middle, getting an idea of what the family dynamics are, what's going on, what are the cultural considerations, what are the traumas, and really get into the middle of that, kind of parse out what's going to work to make that distinction for them. Because when you take into consideration different cultures, what might look appropriate for a white family doesn't look the same for other families. Many other cultures have interdependence. I think when I'm doing that work, the first step is always getting into the thick of the family to try to figure out what's going to work best. But it is something that is hard to negotiate. And I really encourage the families and support systems to hold people accountable for their behavior, even if there is trauma, even if there is guilt of things that they feel bad about. Hold that space and then also the person accountable.
It's been very interesting to me to watch that in families with multiple siblings, the child with the substance abuse problem always gets the most attention in a detrimental way to the other kids. Mariah, what was that like for you growing up, and how did you're watching parents who are probably not giving any of the children the proper upbringing. So how did you cope with that idea that it was an addiction that was actually taking away their love and their time and attention?
Yeah, I think at first I felt probably like a lot of children feel is that my parents chose their addiction over me. How dare they? I just want to be loved. I just want my mom's attention. I want her to keep me safe. The other side of the coin is that it gave me a chance to really search inside myself and find my own inner strength and my own resilience and my own coping skills and my own strategies. It taught me to be very independent in that, and how I coped with it, I think, is just by learning that it wasn't a choice, learning to function on my own.
Yeah.
And then wait for my parents to come around.
You had told me a story about going to lunch with your father, and I want you to share that if you don't mind.
Yeah, it was my stepfather. So also my stepfather struggled with methamphetamines and prescription addiction. And this was my mom's second marriage. So I had witnessed my dad's addiction and then now my stepfather. And I was in my 20s, 30s, I guess, by this point, and I took him to lunch down in Missoula, Montana. And we were at a Mexican restaurant. And I just remember him nodding out at the table. And I was so excited. It had been a year since I had seen him, and he sounded like he was doing so great on the phone. He was talking about his treatment, and he had a counselor, and he had recently gotten out of residential treatment. And I was just sitting across from him at the table, and he was nodding out. and he couldn't eat his lunch. And it took two of us to get him back to my car. And I just remember thinking at that time, he's not going to come back, and I was in school at that time for my graduate degree. And I just remember going, yeah, I don't think he's going to make this. And that was a hard realization because I was such a Pollyanna, as people have called me, very optimistic view on life. And I'm going to save the world. So that was a difficult thing. And he is gone now. We lost him a couple years ago to opiates.
It's so sobering to talk to family members. Connie, I'd love for you to jump in if you would, who have had to actually come to the realization that their loved one actually may die from this active addiction. How often is this clearly spoken about, Connie, at these Al-Anon meetings, and how do you navigate this very sensitive territory?
Well, we do have our many members in Al-Anon who have lost children to addiction, and they are still working a program to live their best life.
Wow.
And our family our son was addicted to everything, and we were addicted to him. If he was having a good day, then we could have a good day. And our daughters really were madder at us than they were our son. They watched us enable him, watched us run interference. And on the one hand, you do try to circle the wagons around your family unit, but the addiction is working 24/7. Somebody said it's like a gorilla doing push-ups in your driveway while you sleep so that he's ready to torture you as soon as you wake up. It's a lifelong thing. That's a huge step that Al-Anon took me to, that this child will always have this disease. And our prayer is that he dies with it, managing it, and not of it. And right now, several people he knows have just recently died of overdoses, unintentional overdoses, I think. But even that, I think your addict tells you, well, that will never happen to you. It's just like the addiction told us, well, we're not like those other families who have had to go to 7 rehabs. We're going to be one and done here. That's just not us. And guess what? It is us. The other parents kind of look at us in fear. They're so afraid that it's catching. And that if it could happen to you, you look so normal. How could it happen to you? Then it could happen to anyone. And that's the answer.
Yeah.
All are welcome.
Millions of times a day. Naomi, when you're talking to family members about this issue of relapse, how do you prepare them for the likelihood of understanding that it is rarely one and done? I would think statistically it's probably fewer than 10% of people who can go to rehab once and never ever need it again?
Yeah, that is a very delicate conversation to have with the youth and with the families. Families often come to us full of hope. Like Connie said, this is going to be it. A lot of our families, they have already put their children through different programs. Sometimes the conversation is just reassurance that we are going to try to provide the skills and tools for this youth to make a good decision, to make decisions that will help them be successful. I sometimes find it more challenging to have this conversation with the families who've been through multiple treatment programs or treatment options because there's just this burnout. They get looks on their face. The same with the youth. It's a very delicate conversation, but it's one that needs to be had because relapse often is a part of people's journeys. But saying that almost feels like, as a therapist, that I'm excusing that, and I'm not. But it's just important for everybody to be on the same page so that they can be the best support that they can be to that youth so that it doesn't turn into a more significant relapse. Here as a team, tell the youth, don't let one relapse take you all the way back down to the bottom. You can always come back here. You can make a different decision. It doesn't have to be a full blown where you were before you got here. But I think really it's just instilling hope, really trying to offer that hope and that support, but be realistic. It's hard to be realistic when you're in the middle of that situation, but how can we as a team support them with that?
You had shared a story about your own childhood in understanding the complexity of addiction. I hope you'll share that now.
Oh, yes. Well, my grandmother died of her addiction, and she was my person. And it was really challenging for me growing up, always having that thought that was already mentioned. If she loved me enough, she would stop. If she loved me enough, she wouldn't drink anymore. Living through all that hope when this disease actually did take her, there was a very shocking and horrifying moment in my life at around the age of 19 when we were cleaning out her house after she had passed away. And we found her hidden, very well hidden, stash of a giant makeup bag full of pills, all kinds of different, anything you can imagine and name, it was in there, plus some that we couldn't even name because they were in another language. And it was really shocking to always have thought of my grandmother as an alcoholic, but then to see her with these pills, it made me kind of reevaluate that, because I think I had an inherent judgment about, well, alcoholics are somehow more sophisticated, or just, all these cultural things that we take in. It's legal to drink. And that was a very shocking moment. It was profound for me as a 19-year-old to recognize how deeply her addiction ran, and how much she was suffering, that she must have, for all I know, she could have been preparing to end her life with those. So it was really a profound moment to recognize how deeply it ran, that it was well beyond what any of us had imagined. Addiction runs deep. And one of the things that we talk to the youth here about is, hey, there's no difference whether you're drinking and smoking marijuana or you're shooting up. Like, it's all the same thing. Nobody's worse, nobody's better. It's all addiction. And we try to look at it from a very equal playing field so that people don't get that I'm better than you, or I'm worse than you, or my story's worse. We really just try to make it an even playing field.
And Connie, you had mentioned that it's not over once your loved one gives up one substance. It might be that they shift to another way to self-medicate. So could you talk about what's happening now with your son and how you're managing?
Now, although our son is very clever about keeping things from us, when he is deep into his use, he will go out of contact. I think the longest was 8 or 9 months. So we don't see it. So we have to kind of piece it together. But right now we think that it's gambling, because he lives with a girlfriend and her young daughter. And I don't get the impression that it would be acceptable for her to have drugs in the home with her child. So we think it's gambling. When the restaurants and bars were closed, it was really good, but they're open now. And there is kind of a pecking order of addictions. Even in our parents group, it's like most humiliating to mention something like a sex addiction.
Right.
And meth is like considered, way worse than alcohol and marijuana.
Yeah.
And gambling, it's like, well, at least they aren't abusing their body physically.
Right.
But it's the same. It's the voice telling him this is okay.
And it's going to make him feel better, if only temporarily.
Yeah.
I'm very curious about the personal toll each of you have had, because I know people are often asking about the well-being of the person you love and how they're doing. And very few people take the time to recognize the incredible mental and physical strain that families are going through. So how are you, Connie?
Well, having my son's disease present was the biggest surprise and the biggest heartbreak of my life. And it continues to be a heartbreak because of all that might have been. Mm. And the life that he is leading is a hard life. Mm. Addiction is exhausting. And trying to straddle both worlds and pass in front of your family and operate in the addictive world, it's exhausting. And we're all exhausted. But I will say this, that it's been a profound spiritual journey for me. Mm. I mean, you find out what you really believe in when you have to just say to whoever your higher power is, I can't do this. This is my child. I'm giving him to you because I have nowhere else to go. I've tried everything. My faith has really been strengthened, and it's very simplified. It's just, me and my higher power kind of having a color commentary all day. What is he doing? Where is he?
Yeah.
And we just chatter all day, and I still try to give God advice whenever I can. I would say it is exhausting.
Mariah, what is the biggest piece and the best piece of advice that you received, maybe not from a counselor, but from another family member?
Yeah, I can think of a couple. Is just self-care, self-care, self-care. I mean, I know it sounds selfish, but self-care. And then one of my coworkers, when I lived in Montana, she had the sweetest saying. She just said, don't give up 5 minutes before your miracle. And that saying to me was just, I didn't even take it as religious, but I do believe in miracles. But I'm like, wow, isn't that the truth? I mean, we could think we're just at the end of the road. We've given up. And even as a supporter, don't give up 5 minutes before your miracle. So that would probably be a piece of advice I would pass on. That's a treasure.
Naomi, do you have any that you could offer people?
Um, I think when you first asked Connie about like the toll that it took,
Yeah.
I started thinking about like shame. And that was the first thing that came into my mind. So that doesn't answer your second question.
No, go ahead with shame. I'm super interested in
It touched
that.
me. It
Yeah.
touched me because I realized that I still to this day, even a little over 9 years in my recovery journey, I still carry the shame of feeling like I should have known better and understanding that I have now passed this to my children. You know, I brought that into their lives now, and that I have to deal with that in a way that's more positive than just walking around with shame, because shame doesn't serve me. That's the personal toll. But what I feel so great about is that when I'm working in a place like Fora and helping other families, then I always think, okay, so I am paving the way for my children, so that if and when they ever get to the point where they start to express my family disease, our family disease, that they have the appropriate supports in place and that I can hope for a better future for them. And that alleviates a lot of my shame that I walk around with. I know that's not exactly what you asked me, but that's
okay.
just
I love that answer anyway.
Yeah.
When I'm talking to you, it reminds me very much of the 5 stages of grief of, you have this denial, and then you have this bargaining, and then you have this, all of those stages of grief are very active when you're dealing with someone with an addiction. But I'd be very curious if you could describe kind of where you're at right now. Are you at acceptance, Connie? Have you accepted that this is your son's issue and not your own?
I am in radical acceptance. I know that has this disease and I need treatment too. And I do things like I joined the board of directors at Fora Health. I took up floral arranging. You just learn to do things that help you escape. My grandchildren are a great escape for me because that is perfect joy. But as far as my son goes, it's always going to be this way. But thanks to his time at DePaul, he and I can speak the language of recovery.
That's wonderful.
I can nag him about getting a job, and then I can say, wait a minute, stop. This doesn't fit with the program that I'm on, and I'm sorry. He's the one who said, you have to forgive yourself, Mom. He said, I had to forgive myself, and that's a breakthrough that he reached at DePaul in those rooms. And he said, you have to go there too. And so that's been very helpful.
Wow, that's so beautiful. Mariah, on the stage thing, where you're at with stage, it's almost like you feel to me like you could have transcended the stages and you're now in kind of that productive place where you're putting all of your knowledge and your skills back to use in our society. Is that right? Is that a correct assessment?
I feel like I'm there a lot of times. Yes, I feel like I've turned the trauma into a growth opportunity for me and future generations. We may not see the effects now of all of our hard work, but I mean, we're planting those seeds now. But there's times, I mean, it gets down sometimes where I'm just like, wow, okay, I'm in grief again. Like addiction is not linear. So
right.
It's kind of that roller coaster ride up and down and twist. So I have my moments, but for the most part, yeah.
Do you have a piece of advice, Mariah, for someone who might be listening and who is like, oh, I could really use the support of women like this or of parents like this?
Yeah, just find your tribe, find your supports. Al-Anon shop, counselor shop. I tell people, like, really shop around, find somebody that meets your needs. Don't walk into a counseling office and think that that's the only therapist available. Support groups are not all created equal. You really do have to do a little bit of groundwork to find your people and find who's going to support you, and just saturate yourself in positive people that believe the way that you do. Really protect your energy at that phase because you're vulnerable.
Yeah. Naomi, I'm curious about your thoughts about early prevention methods and education around addictions and substances. Given that the data suggests that, kids as young as 7 and 8 are being offered drugs in our school systems, do you think that we should have a more robust education plan to try to help kids arm themselves with the information about how to say no and how to politely decline this culture?
Absolutely. I mean, here at Fora, almost every youth that comes through the door since I've been here talks about the young age, the shockingly young age that they were first introduced or first discovered, or older siblings, whatever the situation is. And it's shockingly low. I mean, 7, 8 years old is, to me, I just remember when I was that age, I was thinking about Barbie dolls, not drugs. Yes, absolutely. What you're saying is absolutely right. I feel like my own children are in high school and middle school. That's too late. That really is too late. I feel like for many people, the conversations need to happen preventatively. We need to do that upstream work to try to make sure that we're educating our youth, building up their self-esteem and their resiliency. There's so many things that can contribute to that early use. And the more that we educate the youth and the families, because I remember my own daughter in middle school, she's now in high school. She said in middle school that people were passing around these little gummy bears, and I'm like, 7th grade? Coming here and finding out that that's actually no big deal. Some of them were being offered this in 5th grade.
Yep.
And they sell it in the form of candy. So it looks very appealing to kids, So we need to think about how people are marketing, even with legal substances. How is that being marketed? What messages are we sending when it's candy and cookies?
I am so grateful to each of you for spending the time with me today. Do any of you have anything that you'd like to add that maybe we didn't talk about that you think is crucial for parents or loved ones of someone who has an active addiction should know?
I believe that it is really a parallel journey when you love someone. You wake up every morning and you have to really work through prayer and meditation and calling a friend to not just be overcome with grief and sadness and worry for what, might have been. And I think too that then, meanwhile, your loved one is hearing a different voice, and trying to figure out a reason to be sober that day. And you're both fighting hard, but you both have to learn that we do not have to react to every impulse that comes along. And the whole living in the moment is a cliche, but it is the only way to go. It really is. Having a child with an addiction, again, has been the heartbreak and the worry and the disappointment of my life, but it has also 100% made me more open to people that I would never have met. And people find they have very clever ways to try to talk to me about addiction. And you just know that they are afraid that it's happening to them. Many blessings, many silver linings in this journey.
Yeah. Mariah, anything you want to add?
I really just hope to help dissolve the myth that addiction is a solo, independent illness, and just really help bring education to people that are struggling, either supporting or with addiction, that you're not alone. This is a world pandemic, and until we start providing the education needed to show there's no difference if you told me you have diabetes or you told me you have substance use, until we get that education out there, we're just going to keep perpetuating that guilt and that shame, and just teaching people and bringing hope, changing systems and structures, because I feel like we fail individuals and families with addiction just based on our structures. I really just hope to bring more hope to people and help change some structures. Yeah.
Thank you. Naomi, I'm going to let you have our closing thoughts here.
Well, I was just going to echo everything that Mariah said, because I think, education is huge, especially because I work with the youth. It's just going to be a huge component to helping relieve some of this pressure. Also, just with the hope, also resiliency, like offering other ways. What I notice with this generation that I serve is there's very low frustration tolerance to kind of deal with life stressors. And so the more that we can offer as a society and as a system and individually and families, and it's just some of that resilience and that hope to help them find other ways to cope with life. So those would be the only two things I would say, but I just love what everybody else has said.
Yeah, you guys were really inspiring and so beautifully honest and authentic. I cannot thank you enough for your time. Mariah, Connie, Naomi, thank you again for all of your work and your willingness to be here today.